The nuclear policy of the USA was built on big secrets and lies. It was a policy that risked the end of the world. Today, we have a special guest, Paul Jay, journalist and director of the documentary How to Stop a Nuclear War. He will show us how these old stories still shape public opinion and control our politics. So, how to stop a nuclear war?
That was like the walk-on music for a wrestling show. And which is where Donald Trump learned his politics. I don't know how many people here ever followed the World Wrestling Federation. Well, it was a big thing. It used to be more than 1 billion people would watch it every week, and it's still pretty big around the world. But there was an actual storyline in the wrestling where Trump played a billionaire against Vince McMahon, who owned the Wrestling Federation. And the story was Battle of the Billionaires. And they each got to pick a wrestler who would represent them, and whoever won got to shave the hair off the other guy. So, of course, Trump won, and he got to shave Vince McMahon's hair off, and so on. But the point is, Trump learned how to play a character. And he learned how to get the crowd to pop. So when he goes and he campaigns, he plays a character. And he's learned that in maybe half of America, that character plays well. They like this narcissistic, egomaniac, almost buffoon. It plays well. It's not who he is. He's actually fairly savvy and clever. But the politics is a politics of theater, and the media covers the theater as if it's real, as if you would cover wrestling as if it's real. They cover the theater of American politics. I'm sure it's not only the US, as if it's real. But something real is going on, and it's very dangerous. And behind the sort of buffoon character, there's a cabal around Trump that wants the United States to have its own Mussolini. And Mussolini is the model. And this isn't something new. A section of the American elite have wanted a Mussolini since the early 1930s. And in 1934, there was something called the banker's coup. The most famous soldier in the United States was a guy named Smedley Butler, who was a Marine. They went to him and they asked him to be a front for a coup to overthrow Roosevelt. And behind this coup was the Rockefellers, the DuPonts, the Morgans particularly. They didn't want the New Deal. The New Deal, for people that don't know, I'm not sure, it was a kind of European social democracy as an answer to the crisis of the 1930s. Because the other alternative was fascism. And there was a section of the American elite that wanted fascism in the United States. And it was amongst the biggest bankers and the corporations. And they were all, by 1935 to 1940, they were all doing business with Hitler's Germany. They were selling arms, they were selling petrochemicals, they were selling the gas that they wound up using in the ovens. It was no secret, open, significant trade. And you might ask, well, how was Nazi Germany going to pay for all this? Millions and millions of dollars of goods went to Germany between 1935 and 1940. These American companies actually fronted the money. They loaned the money to Germany to buy the American products. They were so sure Hitler would win. They were quite okay with a Europe controlled by Hitler and Mussolini. In fact, they wanted that, and they wanted to turn that against the Soviet Union, but they would live with a fascist Europe, and they were hoping to have the same thing in the United States. Back up one more step. And I'll try to do this quickly, because I'm supposed to do this in 20 minutes. The United States was founded on slavery and genocide of indigenous people. That means from day one, there had to be a very strong military. So the militarization of the United States begins pretty much at the very beginning. The plantations created cotton on such a scale, it drove the textile manufacturing of England and the northern United States. In fact, Marx said, without American cotton, there would have been no industrial revolution in England. I mean, it would have happened eventually, but not then. So baked into the very core of American culture is militarization for suppressing the slaves, militarization for opening up land, stealing it from the indigenous people, and expanding, eventually, northern capitalism west. At the nexus of all this, both the plantation culture, the expansion west, were the big banks. The banks, first of all, were the middleman on the cotton trade. The banks helped manage the trade of cotton from the United States to England. They even made money insuring the slaves, life insurance. Of course, the money didn't go to the family of the slaves, it went to the owners of the slaves. To get the scale of this, by the mid-1800s, if you assign a value to the assets of slaves, they were worth 3 times more than every piece of railroad, every factory, every farm. That's how big slavery was to the United States. So this culture of the elites, of slavery and genocide, militarization, and then the banks, meaning financialization, it's right in the DNA of the United States. There's so much one could say, but I'll jump to the banks discovered something important in the American Civil War. There's a lot of money to be made out of war. J.P. Morgan, who was the big banker, he was sort of the leader of the whole financial sector. He had a company during the US Civil War that bought old rifles from the Army at $2 a rifle, bought a company that refurbished the rifle by just revarnishing the wood a little bit, sold them back to the Union Army at $22 a rifle. This war profiteering and the big banks, right from the beginning, right from the birth of the Industrial Revolution. In 1934, there's a committee called the Nye Committee, Senate committee, because it was such a scandal, the war profiteering in the First World War, that people were demanding to know, why did the United States enter the First World War? It was a war between European colonial powers to redivide the world. Why did the US even go? So that was, the Nye Committee tried to answer that question. And you know what their answer was? The lobbying of the arms manufacturers, but even more. J.P. Morgan had loaned millions and millions of dollars to the British and French governments. And he was afraid if they lost the war, he wouldn't get repaid. So he got President Wilson to go to the war. This is the finding of a Senate committee, a bipartisan Senate committee called the Nye Committee. And you've never heard of it, and most Americans have never heard of it, because they buried it. Because you know what their recommendation was? take profit out of war, nationalize the arms industry. The actual recommendation of a Senate Congressional Committee. And they buried it. So, why am I telling this history? Because the American elites, into the 1930s, there was a split. There was a section led by the DuPont family, which began as a gunpowder company and then became quite a diversified petrochemical company, went on to become the main company in the Manhattan Project. They were the ones that developed plutonium. But they were for an America first. They didn't want to get involved in foreign wars. They wanted a very repressive American political economic system, and they hated the New Deal. They didn't want unemployment insurance. They didn't want Social Security. They didn't want government employment program. They wanted to get as close to slavery as you could get. Then there was another section of American capital led by the Rockefellers. They saw the world as their oyster. They wanted to create a world with open markets, freedom for American capital, American investment, and capture raw materials and so on, labor and markets. And they were at odds with each other because the Rockefeller vision, they didn't love the New Deal, but they were okay with it. And they got along with Roosevelt. So as we head towards World War II, Rockefellers create a secret committee in 1939, 1940. 100 bankers, lawyers, and corporate leaders working with the US State Department all through World War II to plan what is the world going to look like at the end of the war. That by 42, they knew the Americans, the West, the Allies were going to win. And they wanted a real plan. And the nub of the plan was the bomb. They would have the nuclear bomb. They knew that in 42. They knew it was going to work. You know, the Manhattan Project involved more than 600,000 people, the invention of the bomb. Now, you know, when they show it in the film, it's like one little village in New Mexico. 600,000 people. The biggest industrial project in the history of the world, the history of the United States. Nothing came close to the size of the Manhattan Project. They did it not because they were principally worried about Germany having a bomb, which is the way it's usually told. It was one reason they thought it was possible. But by 1943, they knew there was no German bomb. Even in the Oppenheimer film, they say that. So why do you keep building a bomb if you know Germany doesn't have one? Because right from early days, this vision is we are going to rule the world. And the bomb is going to be the thing that gives us that power. And this secret committee they create is a vision based on the two B's, the bomb and Bretton Woods. Bretton Woods would be the financial architecture of these supposedly open markets. They would use the labeling freedom and democracy, but it was all about creating a global capitalist system in the non-Soviet world that the Americans could dominate. And as all of you know, or you wouldn't be sitting here, it was never about freedom and democracy. They supported dictatorship after dictatorship in order to have this freedom and democracy. I can go more into this, but I'm trying to get back to today. So the architecture of what they call rules-based order, they don't want to say international law, because if you say international law, most of these people in Washington should go to jail. But a rules-based order means our rules, our order. But it means these kind of open markets, elections, as long as the results of the elections don't challenge the global system. If the elections challenge the global system, then you organize a coup. And the evidence that this was, the argument all through the Cold War up until 1990 was all about the threat of Soviet expansionism. They knew that was a bullshit. The CIA was producing every year a report saying there's no threat from the Soviet Union, no military threat. They didn't like it politically, they didn't like it ideologically, but the CIA was telling every presidential administration there was no threat of the Soviet Union invading Western Europe or the United States. NATO was based on a complete lie. Dan Ellsberg, who I'm making the film partly about, called it a protection racket. You know, you pay the empire through your military purchases and your militarization, and we'll protect you. But protect you from what? They knew there was no Soviet threat, military threat. So what were they going to protect Europe from? Socialism. NATO was there to stop socialism from coming to power anywhere in Europe. What the proof of this is one of the first things they did was interfere in the Italian elections, throwing millions and millions of dollars to defeat the communists. They nurtured a conspiracy in Italy called it was under this crazy NATO thing called Guardio, where in various European countries, in the name of protecting against the Soviet Union, they created secret militarized groups to organize the far right to try to attack the socialists and communists, including, countries like Norway, Belgium. Here they developed something called P2, which was Berlusconi was a part of. And the whole rise of Berlusconi, of course the Italian elites are, they have their own agenda, but the Americans were there financing, manipulating. The CIA was very involved. I'll jump ahead, and they told me I have 20 minutes, but I'm going to hang around as long as you want to, if you want to have questions and talk, whatever. So the architecture of global finance, with American dominance, European elites under the protection of NATO, but really NATO as their guardian against the left. That really was NATO's role. But that architecture was meant that the US would dominate. And something happened that they didn't expect. That's the rise of China. This architecture where Asia, Africa, and Latin America are supposed to be cheap labor, resources, markets. There was never supposed to, in this architecture, rise what they call a peer competitor. So this is a big change. So what's happening in the United States now is that we're facing, all of us, but in the US, an existential crisis for American capitalism. They have no idea what to do about China. They want the market. It's too big a market to give up on. On the other hand, it's already, if you're talking about war in the South China Sea, in the area, it's essentially a peer competitor already militarily. Every war game they do, and the Americans do, over Taiwan ends up in nuclear war. Larry Wilkerson, who I know used to work for Colin Powell in the White House, he said they did 7 war games about what would happen if there was a fight over Taiwan. Every single one of them ends up in nuclear war. They had to stop the war game. But this administration, this is what's new about Trump. This is a coming to power of a section of the elites that want to break down the model that was developed during the Cold War. Meaning this: they no longer care about this system of alliances. They no longer care about even the norms of a democratic society. They don't know what to do about the climate crisis except deny it's happening, but they know it's happening. It's not like they don't know. I mean, one of the reasons they're building this wall is not because of cheap labor and immigrants and migrants coming up for work. Within 10 to 15 years, maybe less, we're going to be crossing the 2 and even some people say 3 degrees increase in average global warming. Millions of people that live south of the equator are coming north because they can't, it's going to be unlivable. They're building that wall because they're going to put machine guns on those walls to stop people who are desperately trying to escape the climate crisis. They know it's coming. They know that the financial architecture, the crash of 07, 08, that was just a symptom of a disease. The disease is finance capital has become so parasitical. Speculation is so dominant. They don't understand it themselves, what the hell's going on. They can't even predict when the next big crisis is coming. A lot of this has to do with the digital revolution. I knew a guy who was a broker in the 1960s, and he said, could you imagine doing subprime mortgage? Everybody knows what that was? Where they gave all these phony loans to people that couldn't pay. Imagine doing that with a pencil and paper. Computerization put banking on steroids. So the trigger that triggered 07, 08, these fracture lines in finance, they're all still there. Literally any day you could have another collapse. And I can give you a very concrete example, but you have to ask me afterwards if you want. So, eh? Oh, you want it now? I'll do it fast if you want, if I can. The Bank for International Settlements, which is like the central bank of the central banks, they issued a report about a year ago. They said there is somewhere between 60 and 90 trillion dollars off the books in the global financial system. And what it is they have this thing where, let's say a Japanese company wants, I don't know, 100 million euros. They go find a European bank company that wants yen. So they do a swap. And they say 6 months or a year, we're going to swap back again. So whatever amount of money that is, it doesn't go on their books because it's all supposedly going to swap back. So the BIS said there's somewhere between 60 and 90 trillion in these swaps off the books. So the BIS said, what happens if one side of the swap is in trouble and can't do their end of the swap? And what if that swap is for hundreds of millions? In the BIS document, and you can, if you afterwards, I can show you how to find it. It says it will make the 07, 08 crisis look like a tea party. It said there's not enough money in the Fed to plug that hole. This is just one example of how fragile the economic system is. You have climate. Of course, you have new pandemics. I mean, I'm sorry to be scaring the shit out of you, especially the younger people, but I'm going to get to an optimistic note, I promise. It's coming. So the way they're dealing with this in the US is, instead of, as terrible as Biden's foreign policy was, especially on Gaza and the Ukraine, but as terrible it was domestically, Biden was trying to go back a bit to the 1930s New Deal. Big investments in infrastructure, at least taking climate somewhat seriously, putting some money into climate projects and so on. Banking regulation, environmental regulation. Domestically, it was better than we'd seen even from the Obama administration. I'm not talking foreign policy here. Well, the elites hated it. They didn't like the infrastructure spending because it was being done too much through government. They didn't like the regulation. And here comes the Trumpian campaign offering authoritarianism, deregulation, and most importantly, lower taxes. Biden was going to raise taxes, just a fraction. That was enough. So what the Trump administration represents is this recognition by a section of the banks, Silicon Valley, and traditional arms manufacturers that this kind of authoritarian, Mussolini-style regime is the way out. Their agenda in terms of foreign policy is almost war with China. And maybe it's even war with China. Some of the top generals, I ran into a guy from a big arms contractor in an airport. He told me the war's coming in 2027. This is a guy who's a vice president of one of the largest military contractors. They are planning a crisis in 2027. They want to bring it to a boil. There are people within the Trump administration and now within the Pentagon who are Trumpists who believe you can have a war with China without it going nuclear. And they want it. Their thinking is time is on China's side. They are leading in so many technological areas now. And even in AI, it looks like China is a peer competitor in AI. They used to think the US was ahead 2-3 years. Now it looks like China's at the very least peer. In hypersonic weaponry, China actually has a lead. They're building more ships. But what they don't tell you, the ships they're building are all defensive. They're not building aircraft carriers to speak of. I think they have one. Everything China's doing is mostly defensive. And I'm not trying to suggest China's such a benign power, but it's not the military threat. Because what is the fundamental lesson of the Cold War? They kept lying to us about the threats. They exaggerated the Soviet threat. Now they're exaggerating the China. In fact, there was no military threat from China. Now they're exaggerating the Chinese threat. The Chinese want to take over the world. This guy I met in the airport, I said, why a war with China? He says, because they want to rule the world, take over the world. I said, well, commercially, they kind of already have, haven't they? He says, no, militarily. I said, he said, and the war's coming in 27, he said. And I said, why 27? Why not 28? 26, 29, why 27? He says, oh, that fits with our procurement schedule. In other words, before the Trump presidency is over, they want to make sure to get all their contracts locked in. And what's the great prize? The Golden Dome. I cracked a joke last night, nobody seemed to laugh, so I'll do it again. My line is the Golden Dome. It's not about the dome, it's about the gold. It's a con, a complete out-and-out con, and it always has been, because there's no such thing as an anti-ballistic missile system that can stop ICBMs coming in from space at, I think, 5-6 times the speed of sound. They've described it like hitting a bullet with a bullet. Well, let's say AI, as part of this system, actually can hit a bullet with a bullet. But they can't distinguish between the bullet and the bullshit. Because no missile comes in without being surrounded by decoys. One missile can have 1,000 decoys. It's impossible. It can never work. And they know it can't work because it's not about the defense. It's about the money that can be made. Because what does an ABM system cost is how long is a piece of string. Whatever the hell you can get away with. It's a boondoggle, but it's such a dangerous boondoggle. Because if it works even a little bit, it means the Russians and the Chinese have to, one, build even more weapons to evade it, because the more you can overwhelm the system, the more success you have. And number two, they may have to try to build their own. And it all merges into an AI arms race, which is where we're at. So people like Eric Schmidt from Google, he's warning us that AI is an existential threat all unto itself, because it's going to become autonomous, and it may decide the best solution is not to have humans. This is coming from the guy who ran Google for years. He's an investor in the militarization of AI. And that's the main place these AI companies are making money right now. It was with the Pentagon. And last week, I think it was, the Pentagon just recruited 4 of the leaders of the AI companies and made them lieutenant colonels in the armed forces. I think it was the Air Force. These are one step down from general. These are just corporate tech guys. This is so they can merge Silicon Valley, artificial intelligence, fully integrate them into militarization. All right, so what can we do? Well, to be honest, I call myself a clinical optimist. My great-grandfather had a great line. My uncle, when he was a kid, asked my great-grandfather, "Do you believe in miracles?" And he said, "No, but I rely on them." So I'm kind of like that. But it also means we have to consciously try to bring about such a miracle. We don't have a choice. The choice is the end of human civilization. That's the choice. Because these elites are so in a drug, sex, money-induced semi-coma of yachts and living a ridiculous life. I mean, there's never been, maybe, I don't know, maybe the Emperor of Rome, I don't know, one guy. There's never been a class in the history of the world had so much wealth. And they think they can survive anything. They think they're immune. They can build $50, $100 million silos. They're buying old missile silos, and building these ridiculous bunkers. And I've been saying, just one thing, make sure you take to your bunker, a coffin, because you'll be dead in that silo before there's a world you can live in. It is Ellsberg, Daniel Ellsberg, who released the Pentagon Papers and so on, he called it institutional madness. It's built right into the system. It's so irrational. Like, you would think, for the sake of their own system, to save capitalism, they would deal at least with the climate crisis. But they won't, because the fossil fuel companies have too much at stake. They have the whole militarization. And the other thing that's happened, which is a good thing and a bad thing in some ways, Wall Street has become even more concentrated. In the 07-08 crisis, Lehman Brothers went down the bank, lots of people lost money. The only things that didn't get completely tanked was Vanguard, which is an asset management company that manages the funds for pensions and this and that. I mean, they took a hit too, but what they do is they buy an entire stock index. Well, he's telling me my time's over, but they also told me if I want to keep going, so it's up to you. Anybody want to go, you go. I don't follow rules very well. So when they tell me I'm done, I'm done. See? Anyway, the point is 4 companies, BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, and what's the other one? Okay, there's 4 of them. But BlackRock by itself now manages $10 trillion, more than the GDP of China. One company, then Vanguard, then State Street. They own, between the 3, 4 of them and a few other ones, controlling interest in pretty well every major company in the world if it's traded on a stock exchange, including the banks. This is potentially a good thing. I mean, it's a bad thing because they exercise such enormous power. The good thing is if you ever had a people's a government that actually represented the people, you could nationalize 4 companies, you'd have the whole economy. What can we do? We need to learn how to talk to people that don't agree with us. We're pretty good at talking to people who kind of agree with us. Honestly, we're even better at arguing with people who kind of agree with us. But we're not very good at talking to people that really don't agree with us. So I once had a chat with a guy who was the fire chief at 9/11 at the buildings when they came down. His son was a fireman who was in one of the buildings when it came down. He'd been a Democrat his whole life. After he lost his son, he was so furious at the terrorists, he started an organization called Democrats for Bush. Anyway, I told him I was doing a film I was researching called Why Do They Hate Us? I wanted to take a group of 9/11 families to Pakistan and Afghanistan and ask them to go around asking, why do you hate us? Anyway, I started just telling him how the CIA brought bin Laden to Afghanistan. Do you guys all know this? Some do. Because Arabs that speak Arabic had a mythological profile in Afghanistan where they spoke Farsi or Pashtun, and they thought that meant they were closer to Allah. So they wanted a figurehead for the anti-Soviet resistance. So they bring bin Laden to Afghanistan. And I start telling him some basic stuff about the history, and it blew his brain open. He'd never heard any of it. Something in the United States, I said this last night, 30% of Americans are functionally illiterate. They can't read enough to read labels. 30%. They barely operate at a grade 5 level. 48% barely operate at a grade 6 level. 48% of the population. Now, it's not that much better in Italy, by the way. These people's identity is formed by a school system where history is taught right out of the pages of the Cold War. The only identity you grew up with in much of America, especially white rural America, is your great achievement in life is 2 things. You're an American, which makes you number 1, and you're white. And at least I'm not black. I may be poor, I may not have a job, I may hate my life, but at least I'm white. That's kind of the identity. It's paper thin. People are suffering. which is why they're susceptible to this Trumpian psychosis. But their real life experience is already showing them that the promises of Trump are false. Prices aren't coming down. Life isn't getting any better. Trump's already promising new wars. The lies, the fabric of lies is starting to tear. I wouldn't say the emperor has no clothes, but he's getting close to a t-shirt and a jock strap. I mean, the clothes are coming off. But what's going to take its place? Unless we, and I mean people who are progressive, consider themselves on the left, even if not on the left, at least rational. If we don't learn how to talk to people who don't agree with us, then what's going to take its place is another version of Trump. It will be Trumpism without Trump. They'll come up with Vance, or they'll come up with somebody else. It could be Rubio. But this section of the elites has bamboozled enough of the population that so far they can win elections. But if you remember, I don't know if you know, Trump actually promised not to have elections in 2028. There was a meeting of Christians. It's on a video, I've got it on my website. He says, "My dear Christians, you won't have to vote again, just vote this time." And they're serious. So around Trump is a cabal of Christian nationalist absolute fanatics, led by a guy named Peter Thiel. Peter Thiel's got one of these PayPal billionaires. He owns a big investment in Palantir, Anduril. These are the leading AI militarized companies now working with the Pentagon, who are now front and center to get the contracts for Golden Dome. My point is this. When we talk to people that really don't agree with us, whether they support the far right in Italy or the far right in the United States, it's become their identity because they don't have much of an identity outside of it. So when we talk, and I'm not saying I know how to do this yet. I'm trying to figure this out. We have to find how to talk about these things without challenging their very identity. Like when I talked to that fire chief captain guy, as neutrally as I could, I told him some facts he had just never heard. I'm sure a lot of it is stuff all of you know, or you wouldn't be here. People, on the whole, I believe, and this is where, I believe in miracles. There's a book, a woman named Karen Armstrong. She was a nun, but she wrote the biographies of Jesus, Muhammad, Buddha. She had a great line in one of her books. She says, at the time of the decline of empires, people lose their ideological moorings. They don't know what to believe in anymore. And this is at a time when the great religions emerged, because they offered a new belief system that, especially with Christianity, was very revolutionary. I mean, the early Christians was an anti-Roman revolutionary movement. I think we're at a time where, as dark as it looks, this Trumpian far right, and the same as it exists in Europe and elsewhere, it is going to get so discredited so quickly because they can't and won't solve any of the problems. Hitler was able to solve some of the problem, as was Mussolini, because in those days, militarization was enough to solve the economic crisis in the short term. But it's not now. None of these places can become so militarized that it's going to really alleviate the economic crisis. So we need to get ready. We need to prepare ourselves to learn how to talk to people about what the real history is. People don't have any sense because their identity is wrapped up in a phony version of how we got here. But if we can explain how we got here in a way that doesn't challenge the person's identity, doesn't insult them, respects them, because, you know, I guess it's Jesus, but, you know, if we had to walk the shoes they walked in, we would be the same as them. We'd have the same beliefs they do. For one reason or another, we don't. And I was lucky. I grew up in a left-wing family. I didn't grow up with a lot of the Cold War beliefs. But if I hadn't, you know, Daniel Ellsberg, who finally broke from being a Cold Warrior when he started to see the lies after lies of the nuclear era, but he believed in it to begin with. I mean, concretely, in terms of nuclear war, really fast, Italians should fight to get out of NATO. Italians should at least advocate no first use as a policy of NATO. Italians should believe and get through their heads, as all Europeans have to believe, there is no nuclear threat to Europe. And even if there was, do you really think the Americans are going to trade New York for Rome? It's ridiculous. In fact, Kissinger told NATO in 1979, if you think we're coming with nuclear weapons to protect you, you're out of your minds. There is no nuclear umbrella. It's all bullshit. It was there as a mechanism to control Europe, scare Europe. They even directly lied in 1948 about a Soviet invasion they knew wasn't coming. The CIA said it wasn't coming, and they told the European, anyway, I can go on about this. But the demands in terms of Italy, I think, should be at least advocate no first strike within NATO, and even more so, get the hell out of NATO. Get nuclear weapons off Italian soil. They make Italy a target. They're militarily useless, like as if in a nuclear war you're going to put something on an airplane and go fly it and drop it. It's ridiculous. The Russians would have taken them out in minutes. In the US, we're advocating get rid of ICBMs completely, get rid of launch on warning. There has to be a new treaty. At the very least, Russia, China, and the United States have to be negotiating the limit of artificial intelligence in command and control. There has to be get back to the anti-ballistic missile treaty, get rid of this, like Italians should demand, we don't want anything to do with this Golden Dome. By the way, did you see where the Golden Dome is also going to cover Europe? Well, it ain't. They don't give a shit what happens in Europe, and they never did. So, very specifically, help me get the film out when it comes. Because the film's going to deal with all of this in a way that I think will engage an ordinary audience. It's coming out in the spring of 2027. If you want to help, send me an email. Educate yourself about some of the most important historical points, and then test it. Go talk to neighbors, people you work with, who don't agree with you. And we have to learn how to have these conversations. And then you don't vote for any candidate that doesn't have a plan for climate, a plan to reduce the risk of nuclear war. And if they don't have those things, and a plan to deal with inequality, we have to connect these issues. Anyway, I'm getting all kinds of waves and everything. So technically speaking, we're done, but I'm going to sit here until somebody pulls me off or everybody leaves.